Hello, this is Kimberly Chandler, and I wanted to talk just for a short time about my epigenetic story assignment. So, for this particular assignment, I wanted to look at depression in my family. And there's depression in several areas of my family, but I wanted to trace it through starting with myself, going to my mother, so looking at my parents, her parents, and then their parents. So basically looking on my mother's side because I found an interesting story and connection between her father and her grandfather. So, starting with myself, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety as a result of trauma. And what's interesting about that is there were things that I found out about my grandfather, my great grandfather, after my diagnosis, after a lot of the trauma and the things that I'd gone through. So let's take a step back to the generation above me, which would be my mom. I'd always known my mom. As a child, I always thought she was not a happy person. But as I grew and as I learned more, I realized my mom had been functionally depressed all of her life. And I believe still is. So let's go back another generation above her, which would be her mom and dad. Her father, I found out, had a problem with alcohol as well, binge drinking. Not all of his life, for a short period, which also mirrored mine. And all three of us, my mom, my grandfather, and myself, hardworking, socialized to be hard workers. I mean, that was just the order of the day. You were going to work hard. You were going to get a good education. You were definitely going to make a way for someone else, open doors for someone else. But whatever you did, you were going to do not just your best, but more than your best. In my family, I can remember people saying, 100% is not enough. If you're at 100%, then you're average. And so we grew up with that kind of really high bar set. And one reason is because there are a lot of firsts in my family. And I talk about that in my story. Even in my generation, my family was one of the first in the all-white suburb in which I lived. It was us and one more family. I was the only black kid in my school from kindergarten to fourth grade. So if you can imagine being in those environments, being a truly middle-class family at that time, being in environments where you're the only black or only black and middle class or only black middle class female, that type of thing. And so environment, socialization, all of those things and the times in which we live impacted, from what I can tell now, is my epigenetic story. So let's take it another generation back and go to my great-great-grandfather. And then I'm going to come up and tie it together. Now, what's interesting about his story, and let me say that I interviewed my mom and my aunt for this assignment. What's interesting about his story, him and my great-great-grandmother, is that the recollections of my mother and my grandmother were spotty at times, whereas they were clear at other times. Could some of that be from normal aging? Could some of that be from trauma that they suffered? Could it be a part of what has happened through their epigenetic cycle? It could be all of those things. But anyway, my great-grandfather's name was Virgil Hudson. His wife, my great-grandmother, was Minerva Hudson. Not sure, could not locate the birth or death dates, but from what they could remember, of course, they were born before the turn of the century, and they believed that they were the children of enslaved Americans. And so they were born in Yazoo City, Mississippi, which is where my mother's side of the family, that is our homestead still until today. And in Yazoo City, my great grandfather owned property, which was not the norm for that day. So in the African American community and even outside, they were kind of an outlier, which led the KKK to steal his land, steal my great grandfather's land, and run him out of Yazoo City, Mississippi, which was a practice that was very normal for that time. Many African Americans would run off of their land during those times. But prior to that, from what my aunt, she's 85, said, is that they had a great family life. My great grandfather was a well-known preacher in the South. He would go from place to place preaching revivals, things of that nature. My great uncles as well. I have preachers all through my family. But when that happened, my grandfather ended up having to lead the family to Alto, Louisiana, and where they had other family. And so my grandfather quit school at 5th grade. So if you can imagine, here's a 5th grader now who is the child that has to lead the family to an entire other state as a result of having to leave under these very precarious circumstances. Whereas my great grandfather left from what my aunt says under cover of night to get out so he wasn't killed. So this was very traumatic. And before this, his life was different than after this. So from what my aunt and a little bit of what my mother has said, but my aunt more so, is that he began to drink a lot, whereas he wasn't before. He would still work, but he would use all of his money on drinking. I would figure that's from depression. That's from trauma. And that's the way that he self-medicated. And so, interestingly enough, there was not a lot of information I could get about him other than that, except my aunt did kind of sprinkle in one time in a conversation that he would have these fits, is what she would call them. I said, what are these fits? And she said, oh, they would have to tie him down to a bed. I said, what was that? It was some type of mental illness? She said, well, we didn't call it that back then, but it was these fits, and they would tie him down, and, it would pass, and he'd be all right, but they were horrible. Interestingly enough, my mother never remembered them. So, fast forward, my grandfather, he has all of this responsibility. He gets married to my grandmother, Letty Mae Hudson. They have their children, responsibility. They're doing well. Again, another family that is quite different from other families, other African-American families, even though they were sharecroppers. We had this saying in our family that you can be poor but don't have a poor man's mentality. And so that is how they conducted themselves. But my grandfather began to drink on the weekends. And I said they had a very different relationship as African Americans. From what my aunt says and my mother says, my grandfather was very close to the mayor and the sheriff of the town. These white men, they would come over to the house on the weekends with their families, hang out, but they would go in the back and they would drink. And my grandfather made his own liquor. So they would drink, but my grandfather would get off to himself, by himself, drink. Fast forward, he gave that up, moved to Michigan for a better life, worked very, very hard, raised his children to work very, very hard. My mother, prior to moving, has a baby out of wedlock, as they called it back then. That became a shame upon her. She, when they move, works very, very hard, has to move out on her own with her child. As you can see the pattern, here's a lot of environments where you got to prove you are more than Whatever the embarrassment is, whether you've done it or not, you've got to be more than, you've got to give more than 100%, and you're dealing with trauma at the same time. And so there's this notion of strength that is almost superhuman, but we know we're not human. And so all of that's a part of that epigenetic cycle that is interesting to know, and that I find out, and some of this was new even now for this assignment, that I find out all of this makes sense as to what I went through in terms of depression and PTSD. And so again, the difference is as Dr. Russell Chapin says in her lecture, is lifestyle can make a difference even more than genes. And so whereas for my mother has not been able to make those changes in her lifestyle and is still very addicted to workaholism, not alcoholism, and I don't binge drink or anything of that nature anymore. And I moderate. I would easily be into workaholism if I did not make lifestyle choices that are positive toward positive mental health, and continue to do so. And so I can see where that epigenetic cycle demonstrated how that depression went from generation to generation, but does not have to be a self-fulfilling prophecy on myself as I age. And so that is the short story that is my epigenetic story. Thank you.